Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. So today, we're going to talk about the generational gap in danger and working snug in the wrestling business. So this comes from a Twitter spat between Lance Storm and Jack Evans. So somebody posted a fan posted a video of a indie wrestler taking a suplex on the floor. To which Lance Storm says, "I'm reminded of my favorite wrestling statements. We used to pretend to beat each other up, would barely touch each other, and the fans thought it was real, so we called them marks. Now we really are beating the hell out of each other, and nobody believes it. So now we're the marks." And Jack Evans gets upset on Twitter. So he responds, "Hey Lance, nothing about your statement is true. While you yourself have the reputation of being the easiest to work with, your generation does not. In fact, except for the mid-2000s, when strong style was all the rage, your generation is known for being the stiffest pricks around. How quickly we forget your generation had large numbers of people refusing to take power bombs because they were very sloppily getting dropped on the back of their heads. Your generation is when Bret Hart had his career ended by a super kick. Your generation is the one that told all the youngins to toughen up, tighten up their forearms, causing them to get rocked on a nightly basis. Your generation hit us so hard in the head with chairs that they bent, and we weren't allowed to complain about it. It was the sloppiness, and this is coming from the botch master himself, from your generation, and the stiffness from the strong style folk that caused wrestling to go through a massive change that has made wrestling safer today than ever before. All my big bumps I have walked away from. How many careers were cut short because of the stiffness that came out of your generation? How many wrestlers were butchered from your generation because some prick in the locker room put out a hit on them? Except for in Mexico, hits don't even happen in wrestling anymore. So cut the crap with all the tall tales of how things used to be. Us old heads who survived the shit your generation gave us are not going to stand by and let you shovel it on the youngins now." Lance Storm responded that the statement is true, and the statement was made about my generation. It's a statement about the safety and the need for it. And I thought of it when I saw that spot. Okay, so Jack Evans just went in. Now I think that Jack Evans is wrong. Okay, now here's why I think he's wrong. I think he's looking at individual instances. There were plenty of power bombs in the 90s. Okay, there were plenty of people taking power bombs. People don't want to take power bombs from people who don't know how to give power bombs. And there were people who were not good with power bombs, and they like to do them. But if you can go back and watch plenty of wrestling in the early to mid 90s, and there were plenty of goddamn power bombs. But there was also some botched power bombs. Sid didn't particularly care too much about people's bodies. Same thing with Vader. Similar with Kevin Nash in the way he performed the jackknife. Sometimes he wasn't always the most careful. I think we can look at that and say that's true. I do believe that they did take liberties, especially when Jack Evans had a good point about the chairs, because the chair shots back then, and then the number of them was egregious. You would have guys getting hit in the chair. Like Mick Foley took 13 chair shots to the head. Every week in the Attitude Era, somebody was getting hit in the head. Sometimes they was getting hit in the head multiple times with steel chairs. That was just plain ignorance, though. That was ignorance of not knowing how that head trauma would eventually come back to bite you. But people have always said that guys were working too stiff. There was complaints that Vader was too stiff. Goldberg, who he mentions here about, who kicked Bret Hart in the head, he was always said to have been too stiff. And, so I think that you poke out the people who folks were already complaining about and say, oh, look, this is from your generation. It's like, yeah, but these are probably like 1, 2, 3 guys. It wasn't like the entire roster was, at each other's throats and they were beating the hell out of one another. They were taking dumb bumps, but it was certain people taking dumb bumps, like Mick Foley. It wasn't everybody. Sure, the Hardy Boys were taking dumb bumps. Edge and Christian was taking dumb bumps. The guys in ECW were taking stupid bumps. But not everybody, sometimes these guys get a little defensive, and they're starting to say, "Oh, look at what you guys are doing." Now, even when you talk about what Lance Storm is discussing, which is guys taking suplexes on the floor, that was for a long time how they did things in the South in the '80s. Now it was a superplex that we're talking about here. So he's like superplexed him from the ring to the floor, and it was in front of 20 people in the middle of nowhere, and it was a dumb bump. It really didn't need it. The question I think is that what wrestling has become? And I think the answer to that question is yes. That's why I disagree with Jack Evans, because I'm starting to see a lot more unnecessary bumps from people in matches that don't need it. Like the ladder match was a big deal in 1994, right? Because not too many people had seen it, and jumping off the ladder was completely was mind blowing in 1994. A moonsault could take somebody. It was like wow in the mid 90s, early mid 90s. So today, where everybody's doing a corkscrew such and such, it's a completely different ball game. And I think so that's why I disagree, because I think Jack Evans is looking at it like all the big bumps I took, I walked away from. It's like, yeah, but that stuff accumulates over time. Look at what happened to Jeff Hardy. He was a guy who took huge bumps in the 90s and ended up on pain meds, for the most of his life. Look at a guy like Dynamite Kid, who was, out there bumping like crazy. Another one was Rick Rude. Another one was Mr. Perfect. Those guys who were big bump machines ended up most of the time either injured or on drugs. But guys who were saying, hey, you're taking too many bumps, you're doing too much, slow it down, those guys were wrestling into their fucking 50s. So I do believe that, that what Lance Storm said has some credibility. And I think that him backing off of it was a little too... I think he just didn't want to, get into the generational argument. But I do think that wrestling is a little bit safer today. A little bit. Not a lot. Because, I think that a lot of the wrestlers nowadays are smarter because they had to be. They're not, they're not in such a rush to do the painkiller thing. They're a little safer with the power drivers because now they know, neck injuries are a bigger deal. They don't really do the chairs as much as they used to. Now they take scary bumps. They just jump off stuff a lot. Everything is a dive. And that's usually the craziest part but people just like to take dives. The striking, of course, the punches and the kicks, is weaker than ever, which you would think would be the thing that people would be okay with, is to have a more physical attack style. That's always been the instance as far as physical, forearm shivers and, worked punches, but you still make contact. Not you going in there and it's like Sagat versus Ryu from Street Fighter or anything like that, where, everybody has to walk out with scars. That's not necessarily the case. But you do make contact. Now, guys, it looks like a kung fu movie, and that's the problem. And people are, and it may be safe, quote unquote, but it's not something that people find appealing. And you can tell by looking at the folks that usually they don't. But the Will Ospreay and Ricochet thing, nobody pays big money to see these guys. They're doing their martial arts Jackie Chan fight scenes out there. It looks impressive. They're barely making contact. They're not killing each other. Nobody died. But also nobody is paying to see it either. And it's partly because of Jack Evans being right. That guys had did so much in the 90s as far as tearing each other's heads off with chairs and, plowing each other in the head with, various items and jumping off everything in the world and crashing through tables and setting each other on fire and thumbtacks and barbed wire and all kind of stuff, that they kind of got desensitized to the athletic aspect of what wrestling can be. So they're not both 100% correct, but I lean more towards Lance Storm being right. You probably wouldn't have saw a superplex from the top rope onto the floor in 1992. You certainly wouldn't have saw it in the 80s. You may have seen a regular suplex on the floor in the 80s, but that would have been like a big spot that would have caused for, the referees to come out and an injury angle or something like that. So yeah, maybe somebody would have done it, but they would have milked it. It wouldn't have been in the middle of the match and then you have 10 more minutes of match left. You power drive somebody on a chair or something like that caused an injury angle. You know, today it's just middle of the match, you kick out at one, and then you continue doing what you do. So the psychology of it is very, very different. And it is making people push the boundaries more. So I don't necessarily agree with Jack Evans 100%, but I understand where he's coming from because the 90s and stuff was really stiff. You know, and guys were admittedly stiff. And some guys really liked working stiff. So that's kind of where I agree. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll talk to you guys later.